Welcome to Building Sustainability Podcast with me, your host, Jeffrey Hart, aka Jeffrey the Natural Builder. Every fortnight, join me as I talk to designers, builders, makers, dreamers and doers, exploring the wide world of sustainability in the built environment by talking to wonderful people who are doing excellent things. Hello and welcome to episode 72 of the podcast. This week, we are talking to Sophie Lacey, who is a mindful spaces consultant, a copywriter, and a biophilic meditation teacher. So biophilic design was my obsession of 2021, as anyone who listens to the podcast will have heard just me going on about it again and again. And I am someone who has meditated a fair bit, even if at the moment I am not very well practiced. So to find Sophie, who is combining those two things, was a real treat, and I knew I had to have her on the podcast. If the term biophilic design or biophilia is new to you, maybe you want to check out episode 47 first with Bill Browning and Katie Ryan. That will give you a good basis of understanding on what biophilia and what biophilic design are. Before that, we have about 5 minutes of news. And first up, the wonderful Will Stanix, who was a guest on episodes 24 and 25 of the podcast. He has organised some training workshops with some of my building heroes. He's got plastering courses with Siggy Coco and James Henderson. Now, Siggy Coco was the guest on our last two podcasts, and she is going to be teaching Tadlact and clay finishes. And James, who wrote one of my absolute favourite books on plastering, it is called Earth Render, The Art of Clay Plaster, Render and Paints. He is coming to teach some clay plastering finishes on a lovely roundhouse that my friend is building in May. So well done, Will, just bringing all the best people over here. There'll be a link in the show notes to those courses for anyone that's in the UK. I have Future Build. If you are in London, England, this coming week, the 1st to 3rd of March 2022, then I will be at Future Build at the Excel Centre, and I will be there talking to people about natural materials, earth floors, straw in construction, all the good stuff. So come along and say hello. We are on the ACAN stand, that's the Architects Climate Action Network, which is F74, and Will Stanix is going to be there with me. So come along and chat to him too. Patreon this month, the new patrons are Connor Keep, Dasha Atwood, Sam Tottenham, and Will Stanix. Will has managed to get himself into every bit of news from this episode. Thank you all so much to those four. And now we have actually passed 100 patrons for the podcast, which is just fantastic. My hope is with the patronage that when all the running costs and my time are covered, then I'm going to start paying people to actually just make the podcast better. Like one example of that is that we can get all of the episodes transcribed so that they're more readily accessible and the barriers are removed for people accessing this information. So yeah, that's just one of a whole list of things that with a bit more capital we could be doing to make the podcast better. So if you can support, that would be absolutely brilliant. I'd appreciate that. Everyone would appreciate that. And just a reminder, there is actually 9 hours of bonus audio as a reward for the patrons. 2 whole episodes are with Flo Hamer of the Tiny House fame. We are talking about tiny houses on that episode. And the other is with Will Stanix. Oh, that guy's everywhere. And he is talking about his house build. And I think if I were a better capitalist, then I'd make more content that you get when you support the podcast. But really, I want as many people as possible to hear this and have free access to it. So if you can support, then thank you so much. Okay, on with this episode. There is about 10 minutes from the beginning of this episode with Sophie that will be going on the Patreon. We talked about such interesting things and the recording went over our allotted time. So something had to go, and it was just this first little chunk. In it, Sophie talks about her work as a copywriter and how that introduced her to the term biophilic design. So yes, sad to chop that bit out, but if you do want to hear that, then head on over to the Patreon. I am back very briefly at the end. Enjoy Sophie Lacey.
We're going in from the very beginning with a vision to have mindful spaces, to have places for people to go and sit at lunchtime that is, covered with trees or whatever it might be. And as you say, it's not just a bolt on, let's look what we've got and try and do something with it. Let's actually put something in. And what's really encouraging is to see that is also happening in retail. It's not just, it's not just residential anymore. It's not what we used to call office plus, the kind of office plus leisure space where you might go if you're working, and you might go after work into a gym or whatever it might be. It's not just those places anymore. It's going into a shopping centre, for example, and talking about the roof in a shopping centre that's been designed using natural patterns, fractals, that kind of thing. To see it's actually part of the fabric of a place. Yeah. And the materiality, maybe even the colour scheme, or the way the spaces flow, that it's, people are using these kind of, natural geometry, biophilic enclaves, prospect and refuge, refuge spaces and spaces, more open spaces, that these things are actually part of the fabric and not just added on.
Yes. I stayed at a hotel just around Christmas time where they advertised meditation booths, and really, the reality was that there was a chair by a window that had some headphones, and that was their meditation booth. And I thought, that's a definite add-on. Like, that's not really, I think it's good that they're trying to encourage sort of peaceful spaces, I guess. But and it was in the middle of a corridor as well. It didn't quite.
No, I can see that. It's a kind of it's a nod in the right direction, and actually there is something to be said for implementing sit spots. Places where people literally can just sit, and they've got maybe a nice view. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything very elaborate, but I think you're right. I think there has to be at least some context, some, environmental or natural context to that. Yeah. Maybe we're crossing over into something different with virtual nature and everything coming through the audio visual, which is something else I'm quite passionate about, is the idea that when we do get into talking about biophilic design and marketing spaces from that point of view, that it isn't all visual, because I think there is a huge emphasis still on everything being either visual or audio visual. We also need to talk about our sense of touch and about our smell and our taste. They seem to be still lagging behind in lots of ways, in the way that placemakers think.
Do you think that's because they are harder to implement, sort of making a smell, a feeling in a place?
Yeah.
Not as easy as projecting a picture.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think there are practical limitations, definitely. But I think, again, some of it comes down to intention. And I think that sometimes even using wood in a space, we know, don't we, for those of us that love being around wood, that it has its own tactile quality or its own smell. It's things like that. It doesn't necessarily have to be anything that's overpowering or obvious. Okay. It can be something more subtle than that. just, a beautiful wood that gives off just a natural kind of low level smell.
Yeah.
I've spoken to other people who say that there are movements now to use essential oils in the built environment in a much more deliberate way, which I think is quite interesting, because I use essential oils quite a lot in my meditations, even online, which sounds a bit strange, but it works. Yeah. As long as you get everyone attending the meditation with the right oils, it's amazing what you can do.
Yeah.
So that's something that I think is quite exciting, is using natural oils in an ambient way.
Uh-huh.
And of course, plants, fragrant plants, trees, even grass. And I think sometimes when I talk about intention, I think what I'm talking about also is pointing things out to people. Sometimes it's about just getting people to notice stuff. Have you noticed that you're sitting on this beautiful green grass and actually it smells? It's an awareness thing. A lot of those multisensory things are there, but people are so engaged through the eyes and so kind of caught in their own mind that they actually need help reconnecting with the other senses. And that's even the same actually with hearing, things like, you probably know about this more than I do from a building perspective, but when we talk about things like acoustics, and now I wonder how many, dare I say, inverted commas, ordinary people are really aware actually of what building can do on that level.
Have you ever done the thing, deer ears, when you're out in nature and you sort of cup your ears and just really focus on the, what it is that you can hear by just sort of creating a little satellite dish behind your ears?
Yeah, kind of magnifying the sense. Yeah. It's interesting how people feel somehow that life is enhanced when you get them to engage. I notice this when I teach my natural mindfulness sessions or my forest bathing sessions, that by getting people to tune in, particularly with the sense of touch, it might be something like just getting people to take their shoes and socks off and stand with their feet on the ground and really just feel that connection with their feet on the earth. Or it might be, picking something up from the ground like a pine cone and touching it, or stroking bark on a tree. In the abstract, it sounds a bit daft, because you think, well, do people really need to be taught to do this stuff? But actually they do, because most people are not really fully aware of what their bodies are doing in the environment. A lot of the things that we touch as we go through our day, we don't really register that it's happening. And it's the same with smell and taste. We tend to reserve our sense of smell and taste for the obvious things like meal times, where obviously you're very engaged then. But the rest of the time, you can miss a layer of experience so easily, partly by being distracted.
Yeah.
But also because I think our culture is so focused on what comes through our eyes first, and probably what goes through our ears second. And it's like the three other senses fall behind.
Yeah.
And I think it really matters for human life, for quality of life on all sorts of levels, that we have a much more multi-sensory experience. And so any opportunity I have to bring that into my writing, I will do it. If I'm given any kind of free rein to talk about what a place feels like, fully feels like, what does it feel like to actually be there? I think, great, I've got carte blanche now to create a journey. And maybe it feels sometimes it's a bit of an untapped thing, actually, to bring that into a marketing thing, because we talk a lot in marketing about emotional engagement, people having experiences, particularly in retail now. We talk a lot about It's not transactional any longer. It's experiential. You know, what do people get in this space that's more than just going in to buy stuff? What else can we give them? What sense of connection can we give them? What sense of place can we give them? Can we get them to tell stories and to share things and to really feel connected to that space that we've given them? We talk about that all the time in marketing, but I still feel that we're a little bit behind the curve talking about our physical senses and our physical experience, which is really important.
Yeah. There's a thing I've been talking about this quite a lot recently. Rob Hopkins does a thing at the beginning of his talks when he's talking about how do we get out of climate catastrophe. And he gets everyone to picture 10, 15 years in the future and picture that we've done something magic and we've solved climate catastrophe and everything's great. And he goes through, now imagine you're in that place. What can you hear? What can you smell? What can, and there's something about putting imagining yourself in that place so fully with all of your senses that unlocks what that place actually is.
Absolutely. You've hit the nail on the head that it's immersive if you're engaging all 5 senses plus. And I talk in my forest bathing event about the 6th sense, which is that kind of the slightly intangible, the kind of the intuitive, I guess, the sum total of all the senses coming together, and the sense of place that isn't necessarily definable. We talk about genius loci, and we talk about what is it about this particular place at this particular time that is unique right now. And so it's 5 senses plus something less concrete.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important, and again creates potential when you're marketing places to try to convey to people who for whatever reason can't be in a place or won't yet be in a place, to try to convey to people about a very specific identity, that places have identity and personality. And again, if you can use all of that 5-6 sense language around that to say, this is what's unique here, this is why you should be here. It just gives us opportunities with the language we use. That's why I'm passionate about it, because I think you're essentially transporting the language of meditation, language that meditation teachers and script writers have been using for centuries, and you're transporting those principles into marketing, and you're telling stories, you're creating journeys, and you're telling stories using the same sort of ideas. One of them, for example, being prospect and refuge. When we talk in biophilic design about having secure spaces or safe spaces or little enclaves, places where people can be private, can be detached, can be enclosed. Or you might then also talk about elevated spaces. People the whole prospect thing of looking out and being able to see the space from above or from the bigger picture. Meditation teachers have been using those psychological principles for years and years. This isn't a new thing. This is about the psychology of space and making people feel particular emotions. For example, somebody's feeling very anxious might be taken into a walled garden because it's that womb-like thing of feeling safe and secure. Or somebody who's feeling very underconfident or despondent or a bit hopeless, you might try and take them into an elevated meditation where you say, imagine you're standing on a hillside overlooking a town. What do you see? Watch the people below you. What does that make you feel? Imagine, all the aspects of your daily life going on below in the town below you. It's psychology. It's appealing to our basic needs to feel secure, but also to feel free.
One of my favourite things I was taught a little while ago is, a little sort of 2-minute meditation is to imagine you're looking down on your own head from above, and then you zoom out and you see your space, and then you see your town, and then you see your country, and then you see the earth, and then you see the universe. And I've never made that connection. That's that is prospect. That's
absolutely
overview. Yeah,
absolutely. And when you read all the research behind biophilic design, the patterns, the 14 patterns, and Stephen Kellett, and what E.O. Wilson said when the terminology was first being put together, you realise that so much of this is about our it's our innermost psychological and emotional being that we're talking about. And so much of meditation and mindfulness is tapping into those same drivers, I guess. So that's why I think if we can maybe use that language to tell really good stories, or to guide people through journeys, through spaces, not necessarily in a marketing sense, but I think marketing is certainly a legitimate place to put it. Why not? If you're marketing a space or a place, what you're doing is you're asking people to come in. You're inviting people in. That's principally what you want to do, isn't it? You want to get more visitors to that space, whether it's through a promotional video or whether it's through a brochure or press release. You're inviting people in, and in forest bathing we use the language of invitation. Natural mindfulness, we talk about inviting people. I now invite you to take your shoes and socks off and stand on the earth. How does that make you feel? And it's very important that we use invitation rather than direction, because we want people to feel that they have a choice in what they do and that it's not dictated. And the same principles apply to marketing. You want people to feel that there's something great for them waiting at the other end if they come, but you don't want to be dictatorial either about what you're giving people. You must come. You must come to this shopping centre. That's a quite old-fashioned approach to marketing. Nowadays, it's much more about giving people choice and appealing to their emotions.
So I wanted to talk more about forest bathing. When I was researching this, I discovered that the Japanese government have introduced forest bathing as a national health program.
Which makes complete sense to me.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe some people listening to this might think that sounds ridiculous. I mean, what is it that's... First of all, I mean, what is forest bathing in a sort of general term? But also, I mean, what's it giving us?
The first thing that I find interesting is that forest bathing isn't actually that old. It only really goes back to the 1980s. And the word in Japanese is Shinrin Yoku, which literally means forest bathing. And it sounds like an odd term, but basically you are bathing yourself in the experience of being in a forest. So you are immersing yourself in a forest environment and you are soaking up everything that the forest has to offer you. So from that point of view, it's literally like a bath. You don't have to take your clothes off, although some people I'm sure do. But but it goes back to what I was saying about multisensory immersion. The first thing to say is there's quite a lot of different approaches to forest bathing, and we have forest bathing and we also have forest therapy, which is also incorporating things like talking therapies and circle time. Some people also do foraging and forest medicine, and they pick things and make teas, and they show people, how to derive foods and things from the forest. I don't do that. One of the reasons for that actually is that my forest isn't really a forest. I teach at the Arboretum, which is attached to Oxford University. So it isn't a true deep forest, but the advantage of that is that we have the most incredible variety of trees because it's an arboretum, which I think for us is a huge advantage, actually, because it gives us all these different little zones and patches that people can explore. And essentially what I do is I invite people to have natural mindfulness experiences within that forest space. And we talk about what do we notice here using our sense of smell, our sense of taste, our sense of touch, what happens to our bodies when we breathe, the air, what is that doing for us? So I also do some more kind of traditional meditation techniques using the breath. And we do some eyes closed practice, some meditation, but we also do eyes open mindfulness. I get people to touch things. I get people to pick things up off the forest floor and notice patterns and colours and to feel the bark with their hands. And a lot of it is about grounding and connecting, and then really kind of thinking about what people feel afterwards or what they feel while it's happening. I get people to sit with particular trees to kind of connect. I mean, literally tree hugging. This is proper. Find a tree that you are drawn to and sit with it and communicate with it. What stories occur. And the fascinating thing about this is that people have the most incredible experiences with this. It might be an associative thing. So they might pick a tree that reminds them of a tree that was growing in their grandmother's garden when they were children. And they might start to think about that, their memories and their own story. But also people think about, what does this tree mean? What does this tree feel and see, and what stories does it have? And it opens people's imagination up in the most incredible way. And people often feel that they want to share that when we come back at the end for our kind of circle, our gratitude circle. But then the rest of it is just people having time, either in a group or on their own, just to really connect on a physical and mental, emotional, spiritual level. And I do try to point things out to people, which is where I think it kind of crosses nicely with biophilic design. We do talk about things like fractals. We talk about natural geometry. We talk about noticing on a microscopic level and on a macrocosmic level as well. How there's an interesting concept in Japan called Ma, which is the space between things. It's very much part of the Japanese aesthetic, that you don't just go for the actual forms, you also look at the forms between. So we talk a little bit about that, what happens when you get two tree branches crossing over each other. What do you notice about that interaction between the branches? Quality of light as well. I get people to notice how the light filters through the leaves. Or it might be a sense of hearing. You get people to really just to listen to the sound of the breeze through the trees and what that's like. And it's very soothing. There's a lovely word for it. It's called Scythurism, which basically means the whispering through leaves.
Oh, I love it.
And you just get people to sit there and listen to that sound. Birch trees in particular are brilliant for that real kind of fluttery, whispery. And people tune in on a level that perhaps they've temporarily forgotten to tune in on.
Yeah.
And it helps to calm, obviously, a lot of the mental chatter. So people typically feel very restored afterwards. And we know from studies, there's lots of Japanese studies and studies here as well, around the reduction in stress levels, quite significant reduction in stress, literally after an hour or two of being in a wood or a forest environment. And that's why the Japanese are harnessing it, because they know that it's extraordinarily powerful as a preventative health measure. You get more people into a forest, letting their stress levels drop down. What's going to happen? You're going to get less mental health issues. You're going to get, less physical health difficulty as well. So it is very powerful, and I think it's fantastic that it's taken off over here in such a significant way as well. And I teach it really as an added thing to other mindfulness and meditation techniques. I keep my teaching deliberately quite broad and general, but obviously there are a lot of people who specialize just in forest bathing, and they take it to a whole nother level where you would go off for a whole day or maybe even a few days at a time. My events are about 3 hours long, so in one sense it's a taster session, but even 3 hours make a huge difference to what's going on in the brain.
Yeah, I think I've told this story before, but I had an experience where it was just before Christmas, and I was doing Christmas markets, selling crafts, and it had been a particularly difficult financial year, and I was putting a lot of pressure on these markets. And a few days before the markets, I went into my studio with all my things to sell, and the members of the studio, before I'd even got to the market, they went, "Oh, I want all of those." And it really stressed me out because they were just really simple little coat hooks made of tree branches. And I was stressed. I was like, "Oh, now I don't have any stock to sell." So I had to go back to the woods to get more. And, I walked alongside a river and across a field and into the woods, and was looking through the trees, trying to find, just the right branch, very specific type of branch. And I noticed that after about half an hour, I was completely free of all that stress, and all the, the entire reason I was there was this sort of stress, and it just dissipated. And I spent a lovely hour just plodding through the woods, cutting a few little bits of tree, and kind of came back to my studio to make them into crafts, just as a completely different human.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if I'd fully sort of bought into the idea of forest bathing before then, but I was a definite convert afterwards.
Yeah, I mean that's a great example of how it happens in practice. And I think really, as a teacher, it's more of a guide. Some people just don't spontaneously make those connections that perhaps you did. And they actually need, again, a lot of this is because they're so locked into their own minds, or they're very distracted, or they might be very anxious and have something preoccupying them. But a lot of people just need prompting to connect, to remember. I mean, I don't think that any of this is new. This is just revisiting things that we once were. We know in our deep innermost being how to do this, right? This is our natural state, to be connected with the rest of nature. This thing we talk about in meditation about oneness, being part of nature, not set apart from it. And in a way, this idea of connecting with nature is a bit weird, because actually we're already connected with nature. We've just forgotten that we are. Yes. So this is really about going back to what we should be, what we are and what we should be. But some people just need to remember to go back there, because they wouldn't ordinarily take their shoes and socks off and stand on grass. It wouldn't occur to them. Or they might just think it's a bit weird, it might feel a bit uncomfortable. I think in some ways these things have got a bit of a bad press over time, because it's like, it's a bit woo-woo, it's a bit, it's a bit out there. This stuff isn't for normal people, this is for weirdos, But I think this is all changing. And that's why I think it's really important that we start having conversations about these things in the commercial sphere, rather than be afraid of commercializing well-being, which some people are very afraid of. Why do we have to put a kind of transactional value on this stuff? It's a bit, it's a bit not right. There's something unethical about it. But I actually think it's really important that we talk about this, because we are commercial beings as well. We are, we live in a capitalist system, whether we like it or not. we do need to go shopping and we do need to use office buildings and we do, so let's be real about this stuff and bring it into where people actually are rather than separating it.
Especially this sort of preventative or preemptive healthcare can save, if our NHS can save millions a year because people aren't needing to access their services. Exactly.
Absolutely true. Yeah. And I think, again, we're just at the beginning of that this idea that we, the whole social prescribing thing of, in some ways it seems old fashioned, because I can remember my mother-in-law, who's now in her 80s, saying to my husband, she'd say, oh, well, if you feel low, just go for a walk. And you'd think, oh, for goodness sake, you don't know what you're talking about. Very old fashioned. If you're feeling depressed, you need to go and see somebody and have talking therapy, and you maybe need to take medication. I'm not knocking any of that, by the way, but I think she had a point that actually maybe sometimes, especially on a lower level of stress, maybe the answer is to go for a walk, actually. Especially if you're walking somewhere that is conducive to like your experience of being able to just completely switch off and alter what's going on mentally.
Yeah.
But I think one of the things that was really interesting about lockdown was the conversations I took part in online around how there are people who don't have access to green space. And quite, I can't actually remember what the percentage is now, but it's quite a high percentage in this country of people that would have to go quite a long way before they could get to a park or some natural landscape. And I think that's where we need to start also talking about technology as a kind of portal to these experiences. And again, it's about not separating them, but kind of bringing them together into something, using technology for good.
Yeah.
Which kind of leads me onto a slight tangent around virtual nature.
Let's go for that.
Virtual environment. Okay.
I'm into it.
Well, again, I think you can see that these things are happening in marketing. We talk about immersive in marketing, immersive experiences. For example, using recorded soundscapes to give a place or a space an identity. And meditation teachers are doing the same thing. They're recording natural environment meditations using visual prompts, using soundscapes, bird songs or waves or whatever they might be. So in a way, they're using very similar principles for different purposes. And I just think, again, a really exciting opportunity exists there for taking the best of both worlds and opening spaces up to people that maybe couldn't ordinarily get to those spaces, either for commercial engagement or for health and well-being engagement, both.
Well, when I spoke to Bill Browning and Katie Ryan, they were saying that a photo of nature gives you the same biophilic response, but not as much, as actually a view, or better yet, being in nature.
Yeah.
So I wondered what sort of, I guess, limitations you see in the sort of virtual nature world.
We'll be back after a quick break.
Hey there, I'm Mick from the Mick and Pat Show.
That's right, and I'm Pat.
Looking for a podcast that's like catching up with old friends? Well, you're in luck.
We're here to bring you weekly doses of lifestyle commentary, discuss culture and politics, and top it off with the occasional beer and film reviews.
But it's not just about us, we're a community. Our listeners are our kin, and we let you all have a say in what we discuss.
So saddle up and join the conversation at the Mick and Pat Show. You can check out our website or find us wherever you get your podcasts.
There are undoubtedly limitations, as you say, that we know from research that there are positive impacts on the mind body, that they can test what happens in brain waves and brain the structure of the brain and all that kind of thing. And they know that we respond in certain ways, even to things like the color green or natural patterns, natural geometry, all that kind of thing. But you're absolutely right. It's not the same as being there. And I think the answer is, again, to go back to the multisensory, to try to use as much multisensory prompting as you possibly can. So from a meditation perspective, I would give people visual prompts, visual guides, invite people in using their kind of visual memory. And that's an interesting one in itself, because some people can't visualize. And so you will get the occasional student who really struggles to be visually where you're kind of suggesting that they could be. So we're not using film or photography. We're actually relying on people's memory, associations. And for a lot of people, that's very powerful. With mindfulness, you obviously are using actual pictures and spaces, but with meditation, it's much more about the kind of the internal spaces that you're creating. But then also I would try to bring in sound to that as far as I possibly could. And also I think I haven't fully quite got my head around what you can do with this from a technological point of view, but I think there is scope over time for working more with the haptic sense.
Haptic is touch.
Touch, exactly that. And I think I had my first ever virtual reality experience the other day at the Van Gogh exhibition in London. And I loved it because one aspect of it is about, 10 minutes long. You get taken through from his house in Arles in Provence. You get taken out of his bedroom, down the stairs, out the door, through a field, and field of wheat with the haystacks that he was so famous for. You go through the woods and there's sunflowers, and then you go down into the town and you go onto the harbour and you see all the lights, and it is the most incredible thing. I did it twice. It was so exciting. I was like, I want to do this again. And visually it was stunning. And, there was a soundtrack as well. So it was picking up a little bit of bird song and the odd mooing cow and all that. Very convincing, very, very real. But the one thing I really noticed was I felt slightly seasick because there was no physical grounding. I was sitting on a chair, so I had my feet on the ground and I knew intellectually where I was and that I was completely safe. But it was very interesting to me that I shut my eyes in reflex as I was going through a painting. My body was fooled enough to react as if I was in a real space. And the reason I think I felt slightly woozy was because there was nothing happening on that haptic level. So I felt quite ungrounded. And I wonder whether there are clever ways with virtual reality or augmented reality of bringing in more kind of real touch aspects. Yeah. Somebody very clever in kind of 3-dimensional design would have to explain how you would do that. Maybe they'd get you standing on, a bit of field or something, bit of earth or something like that. Or maybe you could have something like some walls near you made of bark or wood that, so that you've actually got some sort of connection, suggested connection anyway.
Yeah. It's that immersion thing, isn't it?
It's immersion thing again. And the same with smell and taste. Maybe not so much with taste, but with smell. Maybe it would have been even more incredible if they'd been able to create the smell of that field or the smell of that wood, had some sort of essential oil diffusion system going. And I'm sure there are people who are doing that out there. But I think it does feel a little bit like the missing link with immersive experiences. And And from a meditation point of view, again, that movement is happening now that we use more aromatherapy, for example, or I very often bring real plants in to my meditation. So if people can't meditate with me outside, I'll take the outside to them. And I'll get people to smell flowers or leaves, or feel them in their fingers, or break bits off and just be with them. And people seem to love that, because even though they're very connected, a lot of the people I teach, they might have a garden and they're very connected. It's a whole new thing to actually ask people to notice, what's going on right inside that flower. Look inside the petals. What do you notice going on in there? And they're like, oh, I'd never noticed before that there's 3 different colours of purple in there, or whatever it might be.
Yeah. It's that difference between sort of looking and seeing, isn't it?
Exactly.
I think it's partly maybe because, well, my understanding is that what the eye actually sees is quite sort of more like sort of 20% or something like that, and then the brain fills in all the gaps with sort of experience. Is my understanding anyway. And I think when you actually stop glancing over something and actually look into it into real detail, you really get what's truly there, rather than maybe what you imagine to be there.
Absolutely true. I mean, take something, for example, like a beautiful piece of wood. Now, you work with wood, so you know that you probably have either acquired a connection, you're already naturally very connected with what wood can do for you on all sorts of sensory levels. A fresh cut piece of pine. I can still remember as a child, I'm Swedish by heritage, half Swedish, and I can remember my dad building a house for us in the forest in Sweden. He made one of these kit kind of timber framed, like a what we call a summer house, where it's all pine planks with a veranda that goes around the outside. And I can still remember, I was probably about 5 at the time, and I can still remember the smell as he worked away on his Black & Decker, that incredible smell of wood. And when you've had those experiences, you know the power of those experiences with something as simple as a piece of wood. And lots of people love being around it, but I sometimes wonder whether they really understand why. Why does it feel so lovely to be in a wooden room? And it's not just because it looks warm and because it's natural. It's also because of the way it feels and the way it smells. And so again, it's just about inviting people to be aware.
What I find really fascinating about what you're doing is that it's sort of flipping the biophilic patterns on its head a little bit. It's, there's all these patterns on how to make a biophilic space, but you're using the patterns as a guide as to what to look for when you're actually in that nature. And, seeing the fractal, seeing the prospect, seeing all these different things. That's a really wonderful thing.
It's I refer to it sometimes as biophilic design at source, because in a sense it's the source material for where these patterns came from in the first place. Although those research realities, that evidence comes from somewhere. The fact that we have a particular affinity to savanna, the reasons why. And that is nature. It's nature that's given all of that to us. So let's go back to that source for a bit and investigate why that is. Let's put ourselves there. I guess that's really my raison d'etre, is that kind of merging those two things together, the natural and the built. And trying to find opportunities to talk about them, to write about them, and to offer that to people, just to kind of, I guess, to take their marketing messages up a level or two, because I think there's not enough messaging yet, although it's beginning. There's not enough messaging yet in that space.
Yeah.
And it makes such a huge difference to the value that can be gained from being in, you know, whether it's a beautiful living room in a house, or whether it's a really sensitively designed floor of a shop, you know, whatever it might be. There's just huge scope.
Yeah, absolutely.
With that. So
can we talk meditation for a little bit?
Of course.
Because I had a realization last night when I was prepping for this conversation that, well, I found it fascinating that you're writing scripts for meditation using biophilic principles. And I thought about it. I was sort of comparing it to maybe someone who's creating a virtual space, a computer game or something like that. And what you've got is so much more powerful because you sort of create the space and tell people what to look for, but then they're filling in all of the little details with their own memories and their own experiences.
Yeah.
And to create something that's, you know, infinitely personal to them. It's not, you're not telling them what to see. You're sort of, giving them the framework to see it. And I think that's just, I mean, that concept blew my mind a little bit, if I'm honest. Just how positive that can be. And I've never really, in meditation, I've never really necessarily got on with led meditation. I've been much more of a sort of mindful look at breath.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Kind of, and I've always been a little bit dismissive of the sort of journey type meditations. And well, you know, now I feel a bit foolish.
I mean, I should acknowledge that there is, even as, you know, when I did my diploma, we had a lot of talk on that course around whether guided imagery or guided visualization, as it's called, is that actual proper meditation. You know, because there are purists who will say this is a kind of newfangled thing, that it really relates to hypnosis and kind of psychoanalysis. You know, it comes from a different tradition than pure meditation. But then there are types of meditation in the sort of spiritual traditions that do have a visual element. You know, there's no doubt about that. In certain types of yogic meditation, for example, you will use some sort of visual prompt, or it might be a mandala, or it might be some sort of, you know, you're encouraged to see a deity, for example. So there are types of meditation that traditionally use guided visualization. But I think there is a feeling that we've kind of rather over-egged the pudding when it comes to guided journeys, that is what people think of as meditation, when actually there's so much more to it. And a lot of people prefer a mindfulness practice, which is, as you say, breath-based, just sitting, literally sitting with the breath, paying attention to the breath, and using the breath as an anchor point, you know, steering the thoughts, being aware of the thoughts, and then coming back to breath, kind of steering the mind back to breath. And I teach that as well. And I try to be very clear with my students that when we're doing a particular meditation, we're using this technique, but there are many others. And that this type of journey meditation is a specific kind, and that you don't have to follow that. If your meditation takes you somewhere else, then go with that, you know. So yeah, I am talking very specifically about that journey creation side of things. I would just encourage people who haven't done it to try it, and if you find that it doesn't work for you, I mean, there is a sense in which you're escaping. I think that's one of the issues that purists have, is that it's not truly mindful, because if you are practicing mindfulness, you are in the present moment. It's present moment awareness of where you are now, what your body's doing now, what you're feeling now, what you're thinking now. Whereas if you're taking someone on a journey, you are essentially transporting them away from where they are. So there's an element of distraction. And I think that's the difficulty that some people have with it.
Yeah. It's sort of a bit more like watching the TV.
Yeah, kind of. But then you also have to think, if you're watching something like Winter Watch, for example, we know that people benefit from watching nature films, right? They're not there. They're being taken somewhere else. They're being taken into a wood in Scotland somewhere and being asked to watch the foxes or whatever it might be. They're not there. They're being transported, but it's still incredibly good for them to be engaging. So I try to focus on the fact that it's a positive in the main.
Yeah.
Depending on where you take people, obviously. And I do have some ethical framework as well about particular scenes that I won't take people into, which is something that I was taught on my diploma, just because, again, that whole thing of psychology of space. And I don't want to knock other meditation teachers who do this. I have to emphasize that. But for me personally, I'm not comfortable, for example, taking people up into outer space.
Right.
And I wouldn't take people under the sea either. And there are meditations where you are taken down under the sea and you're asked to pretend to be a mermaid. Great. If that floats your boat, pardon the pun, to be a mermaid, fantastic. But I actually think that you are risking making somebody feel very anxious.
Yeah.
Or ungrounded. And it's the same with asking people to imagine that they're on a flying carpet. You know, if I take people into an elevated space using the principle of prospect, I always do it so that people are grounded on earth. It maybe sounds a bit batty.
No, not at all. It's you're trying to replicate a space where they could genuinely be, isn't it? You know, you're in a natural space. So we can't be floating in the air. We can't be underwater.
No.
Sort of in a natural form.
Yeah.
We could be stood at the top of a mountain, or we could be on the edge of the Grand Canyon, or
exactly
spaces
that.
like that. It's
partly because of the fantasy and disbelief aspect, but it's also because some people some people can't quite do the suspension of disbelief thing that, you know, you're meditating that you're under the sea. And so in the meditation, you can breathe underwater and everything's fine. Some people can't do that. They will be too worried that they're going to drown, basically.
Yeah.
So I think you just have to be a little bit responsible. And as you say quite rightly, trust that people will fill the gaps, you know, and it's fascinating when, for example, I take people into a beautiful walled garden with a stream and we go and, you know, I suggest that people sit on the grass and watch the stream, and we talk about watching leaves on a stream as a mindfulness practice. You know, imagine that each leaf is a thought that you're casting aside and you're watching that intrusive thought disappear. But what's interesting is that when people do the discussion afterwards, everybody's garden is completely different. You know, they've got different trees, different flowers growing. They might have a different, you know, some people might have paving, some people might have grass. You know, if you're not too prescriptive, which I think is really important, you give people pauses to do their own thing, which crosses over, as I said before, with marketing prompts as well, that you don't dictate how people are going to connect with a space, that you allow people to kind of make it their own journey. But it just fascinates me, the variety of experience that people will have. And some people will say things like they can't quite get out of logic. So they'll say, but it didn't work for me because you couldn't have a stream that was running that way along the gate, or whatever it might be. And you think, okay, you know. So, and that's interesting in itself, that people will be very, very super logical about things as well.
Yeah.
Or they'll be very imaginative. You know, they'll have a tree that sprouts, you know, pink leaves. So it's one extreme, one extreme to the other. And I get the enormous privilege of taking all this in and thinking, that's amazing. I wonder why that person thought that and the other person didn't. The other person didn't.
To anyone listening to this that doesn't meditate, I mean, I would put myself in that category at the moment. It's always something I aspire to do, but
I think again, this was something that we were taught on our course, that it's really important not to make it another kind of chore, something else I have to do. And I notice on LinkedIn that there is a bit of a culture sometimes that, I get up at 5 o'clock, I meditate for an hour, I do my yoga, then I go for a walk, and then I get to my desk by 7:30. And you think, oh, for goodness sake, how do you fit all this stuff in? Let's be real here. Meditation, like anything else, needs to be achievable. Otherwise, you're just not going to keep at it. And so, particularly for new people, I say 5 minutes a day. If all you can do is 5 minutes before you brush your teeth or before you go to get to bed, of sitting comfortably and just tuning into your breath, being aware that you're breathing, notice what's going on in your body, notice what's going on in your mind. That very, on the surface of it, simple sitting with breath for 5 minutes, I would think is a brilliant introduction. Some people find sitting with breath almost impossible, just the idea of it. So we might talk about using some mantra or some words, some English words, doesn't have to be Sanskrit, using, literally, I am breathing in, I am breathing out, I am breathing in. I even, for some people, which might sound like I'm talking myself out of a role here, but for some people, apps are really useful. I think there is a place for those. There's no doubt. I don't think it replaces being in a group, and I don't think it replaces being with a real life teacher. I would say that, wouldn't I? But that's partly because of ironing out obstacles. Things like getting your posture right, or what do you do when you just can't switch off? Yeah, it's very difficult to get that sort of advice from an app. I mean, you can message people, but in reality, I think if you can get some actual real life teaching, even if it's just for a short time, to develop a good habit. So yeah, I mean, there's so many different options out there, and I don't think there's any problem either in advising people to try lots of different techniques, because Vedic meditation using mantra is a very different experience from Buddhist mindfulness, and some people will resonate with one and not the other. So I'm not going to sit here and say I prefer one over the other. As I've said, my approach is very broad, and if I do a course, so I'm doing a course of workshops at the moment, about 8 workshops, and I deliberately make them very, very varied so that people can just try different things and then decide what they would like to pursue, because we're all wired so differently.
Oh, I'm inspired to. I've created a little space just there. This is rubbish.
Oh, fantastic. Audio, yeah.
But just next to a big, I've got a roundwood timber frame in my house, and it's just in front of that where I intend to sit and meditate.
Brilliant. So, I love that. I love the fact you've got a dedicated sit spot, a dedicated space to go, because I think that's all part of making this regular. If it becomes part of your routine rather than something you have to carve time out for, then it's just it's something that happens, and therefore you will take to it, and over time, I say to people, build up from 5 minutes to 10 minutes, and then maybe from 10 minutes to 20 minutes. But I'm certainly not one for saying, people have to sit in meditation for 3 hours at a time, because it's just not realistic for most people anyway. It's not realistic, unless you're going on a retreat or something, in which case you might be sitting for hours at a time. I think it really, my mission with this is to try to make it as accessible for as many people as possible.
Mm-hmm.
And to try to be really relatable as well, because I think it's the same with yoga. I see it with a lot of well-being modalities, that we're almost cast as these ethereal, angelic beings that live on a different dimension, you know, and if we're not sort of meditating for 4 hours a day ourselves, and we don't have that peaceful expression on our face that says that we've spent the last 4 hours in mindfulness, you know, what right have we got to teach? I think we're human beings, whether we're teachers or whether we're practitioners. We are human, and you're supposed to approach this stuff as a human being.
Mm-hmm.
And you know, if you ask a lot of us, many of us will come into teaching in the first place because we have our own issues with anxiety, either now or in the past, or people have been through some sort of health crisis or mental health crisis, and they found meditation as a way to deal with that. So yeah, we've got to stay with our feet on the ground.
Big thanks to you, Sophie. That was wonderful stuff. I can't remember if I've ever spoken about this, but I do sometimes like to wander slightly away from the main topic of the built environment and sustainability within that to talk about sustainability of ourselves. I think it's really important that we who are so passionate about creating a healthy future through our work with the built environment, I think it's often that we end up forgetting about looking after ourselves. So I keep dropping in these episodes as a little nudge for you to remember just to look after yourself. And yeah, I'm excited for the next time you go out in nature to look into all the different patterns that are going on and really take some time to explore what's in our natural environment. Let me know how that goes. Okay, that's it. You've listened right to the end. Why not share this episode to someone who you think would benefit from it? Or leave a review on Apple. You could write a nice little review. Or if you listen on Spotify, now, if you've updated your app, you can give this a 5-star rating. Other ratings are available, but not for this podcast. Okay, that is everything. Enjoy nature, and I'll be back soon. Cheers then. Bye-bye.